Morning, everyone. My name is Matt Waskevitz. I am the lead planner here at the Department of City Planning on City of Yes for Economic Opportunity. Before we begin, just a quick housekeeping item. If you could bring up the screen, please. Thank you. So we will have live interpretation for today's session. Please click on the interpretation icon for Spanish, Mandarin, or Cantonese to hear a simultaneous interpretation of the session. Spanish, Mandarin, or Cantonese speaking participants may also contact us for additional assistance via email at dcpcityofyes_dl@planning.nyc.gov.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Dan Gorodnick, Director of the Department of City Planning and Chair of the City Planning Commission. We really appreciate your being here today and joining us for this conversation. If you're tuning in, you probably have already been engaged with the public review of City of Yes for Economic Opportunity, whether you're a community board member, an engaged New Yorker, or one of our dedicated city planning staff members. We have had over 100 public presentations and meetings since this initiative was referred for public review at the end of October. So I'm not going to belabor too many of the basics here. That said, across these many meetings, we've heard some topics and questions come up repeatedly from different parts of the city. So for that reason, we're hosting today's session to answer these frequent questions and to clarify some of the most confusing issues. But by way of quick overview, City of Yes for Economic Opportunity is a set of zoning changes to support New York's economic growth, small businesses, and vibrant commercial corridors and neighborhoods. It is our attempt to modernize the way that our zoning governs commercial and manufacturing businesses. In fact, many parts of our zoning resolution for commercial and industrial districts haven't been updated in over 60 years, and they no longer even reflect the realities of today's economy. In many places, they arbitrarily and needlessly restrain small business growth, entrepreneurship, and innovation. Give you some examples. In certain commercial corridors, you can easily cite a tennis court, but not laser tag. In a home, you can be a music teacher, but not a barber. You can have a rock band in a bar, but in many places, you can't dance to that same band. You can bake bread, but you can't make salsa on a retail street. Those sorts of barriers and so many others contribute to our city becoming less vibrant over time, having fewer people able to start that business, having one more vacant storefront, having one more business leave their neighborhood or the city overall when they need to expand. In short, City of Yes for Economic Opportunity will make sure that our zoning helps and doesn't hinder our city's ongoing economic success. And as we continue to recover from the effects of the pandemic on our economy, New York has returned to our pre-pandemic private sector jobs total, but there is a lot more to do. This proposal is how we intend to support successful neighborhoods, good paying jobs, and most of all, ensuring that New York remains a city where you can make it as an entrepreneur, a worker, a creator, or someone who wants to contribute to our city. If you'd like a policy overview of this initiative, I encourage you to visit nyc.gov/yes economic opportunity. This initiative is currently being considered by community boards and borough presidents. Next up, the initiative will come back to the City Planning Commission, where we will hold a hearing and a vote. That hearing will be on Wednesday, January 24th, and the public can testify in person at our hearing room at 120 Broadway or via Zoom. Visit nyc.gov/engage for more information about how you can participate on the 24th. We hope you'll come out to support this vital initiative for the economic health and vibrancy of our city. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope that this conversation clarifies the content of the proposal. We know there's been a lot of questions and even some misperceptions that we hope we can clear up here. And an important note on that point, over the next few months, city planning will be able to modify the proposal to address concerns. But if the concerns don't properly understand or misunderstand what we're actually proposing, we can't really address them. So we want to craft here the strongest possible proposal for the future of our city, and having a conversation based in facts is pretty key to that understanding. I will also note that City of Yes for Economic Opportunity is the second of 3 City of Yes initiatives coming out of the Department of City Planning and this administration. The first of them, City of Yes for Carbon Neutrality, was recently adopted by the City Council, will make it much easier for New Yorkers to go green. So I want to take a moment and thank Speaker Adams and the City Council for their approval of that initiative. The third proposal for housing opportunity is aimed at creating a little more housing in every neighborhood. It is right now still undergoing its environmental review. It will begin its formal review by community boards later this spring. And I want to be very clear that while there has been some confusion between these 3 proposals due to the similar names, the discussion today is focused solely on economic opportunity. That's proposal 2. We're not focusing on housing today. On that note, let's get right into it. I'm pleased to introduce our hardworking project manager on this initiative, Matt Waskevitz, who's been touring the city, presenting multiple nights a week, every week for the past couple of months. Matt is joined by 3 great community leaders who have heard some of the repeated questions that stakeholders and constituents have, who are going to be getting to the bottom of them over the next hour. They are Rafael Espinal, who is the executive director of the Freelancers Union and former council member from North Brooklyn. Rafael, thank you. Good to see you. Laura Rothrock, president of the Long Island City Partnership. Laura, thank you for joining us. And Kevin Guscott, who is a Brooklyn small business owner and special project manager for the Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce. Kevin, thank you very much for being here and for asking these questions. So what's going to happen is after Matt gives an overview, we have asked this team of panelists to take the hardest questions, the most controversial, the most confounding and confusing issues that we've heard at community boards, and to pose them directly at our city planning team, specifically at Matt. I've told them to be as direct and mean as possible. So congrats for being on the hot seat, Matt. My apologies in advance. The point of today is to dispel myths and also to share accurate information directly to you. So Kevin, Laura, and Rafael, we thank you for joining us. We really, really appreciate it. So I'm going to go off camera for the next hour, but we'll come back when it's time for us to wrap up. With that, over to you, Matt, and good luck.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you everyone again for joining us this morning. I'll give just a little bit of information before we get into questions about the journey that we've been on, the process that we've been on that's led us to this point. So before diving into the proposed zoning changes, coming out of the pandemic, we as a city saw an unprecedented shock to our economy, in addition to the public health crisis that we saw. And so during this time, we at the Department of City Planning began looking at ways that our zoning might be getting in the way of small businesses being able to adapt rapidly to changing economic conditions. And so we started speaking with organizations and individuals whose day-to-day work was helping small businesses navigate this uncertain time through many complex regulations that the city has. So we spoke with small business owners, chambers of commerce, business improvement districts, industrial service providers, advocacy organizations, and other stakeholders across our city, sharing a handful of issues we'd heard, but also asking if we had these issues identified correctly and what else we might be missing. And so over time, these kinds of questions and issues raised on the screen here are a snapshot of the kinds of things we were hearing. that New York City can be a very challenging place to run a business, and that unfortunately our current zoning all too often plays a role in making it harder to start, to operate, and to grow a small business here in the city. And so over the last year and a half, we've had an iterative process shaping these proposals. And as they were being developed, on 5 separate occasions, we also had citywide public information sessions with the general public and sharing with New Yorkers the same issues that we'd heard, asking folks who were joining these sessions same kinds of questions, and just making sure that the proposals that we were starting to think about crafting both had an eye to and balance the needs of small businesses with safeguards to protect quality of life for neighbors. Next slide, please. And so the proposal that we began the public review process in October is a result of this year and a half now of public engagement. And so our overarching vision for this work is to make sure that our zoning works for our economy and not against it. And we want to make sure that as a result of these changes to our zoning, we would have zoning that's more simple, it's more adaptable, and more modern. So how do we achieve this? We have 4 goals. The first, we want to make it easier for businesses to find space and grow. The main way we propose to do this is by lifting zoning barriers so businesses can be closer to their customers. Second, we want to boost growing industries by reducing obstacles for emerging business types, which can help these emerging businesses thrive across our city and create good jobs. Third, we want to enable more business-friendly streetscapes through zoning changes that can deliver more active, safe, and walkable streets. And fourth, and finally, we want to create new opportunities for businesses to open in the future, creating new kinds of zoning tools that could boost job growth and business expansion across all 5 boroughs. Next slide, please. So many of you listening in may be familiar with the 18 components of City of Yes for economic opportunity, but for those of you who are not, I will go through at the highest level each of the 18 proposals we have to change our zoning to meet these goals. Next slide, please. Goal 1 is all about making it easier for businesses to find space and grow, lifting zoning barriers so that businesses can locate closer to their customers. So in most cases, our zoning rules around business and business governing our businesses, they've not been updated since the early 1960s. It's long past due to update our zoning to reflect and respond to today's economy. And so our first 6 proposals do just that. They make our zoning more simple, more adaptable, and more modern so businesses can more easily locate and grow. Proposal 1 is about storefronts deemed non-conforming. They face an arbitrary 2-year time clock to reactivation in some locations, or else they have to remain vacant. Now, this is a direct contributor to storefront vacancy in our city. What we're proposing here is to remove that 2-year time clock in the places where it exists, so vacant storefronts can become reoccupied. Proposal 2. Many places in our city, we have similar zoning districts that may be located along the same corridor or on opposite sides of the street, and yet they allow for different kinds of businesses. This is an outdated, confusing set of rules that routinely holds back business expansion and location. What we're proposing here is to simplify the differences between our 2 versions of neighborhood commercial districts and 3 versions of office districts to make it easier for businesses to know where they can locate. Proposal 3. Despite changes in technology and a vastly different economy, our city's rules treat many kinds of small production businesses like they're the same as those in large factory settings from the mid-20th century. So what we want to do here is allow for production businesses that are clean and quiet, things like a pottery studio, a bakery, a coffee roaster, a jewelry maker, maybe an apparel designer, a 3D printer, or things like that, to locate in an empty storefront or an office space. Proposal 4 is about if one of the production businesses I just mentioned wanted to move into an upper floor of an empty office building today, they could face some rules that require them to add additional loading docks, even if they don't need them, even if the building can't accommodate them. And so what we want to do here is allow for older commercial buildings to change over time, not mandating that a business tear apart the ground floor just to provide new loading docks. Proposal 5 is about ways in which our zoning it allows for businesses to have a mix of residential and non-residential uses in many places, but the zoning sometimes restricts the way in which those different kinds of activities can be within a building. Now, this limits options for new buildings that contain a mix of uses, but it also limits options for older buildings to adapt over time, particularly our city's office buildings, to be able to adapt to partially to residential uses. So what we want to do here is enable renovations of mixed-use building or new construction of mixed-use building in places where it makes sense, provided that complete separation is maintained. Proposal 6 is updating the terms we have for classifying business types in our zoning. The zoning hasn't been updated since the 60s, and so it's full of things like typewriter repair and taxidermy that can make it harder for new business types like cell phone repair to know where they can locate. So what we're proposing is to simplify and modernize terms we have to classify businesses. Next slide, please. Goal 2, all about boosting and supporting growing industries, reducing obstacles in zoning for these emerging business types. So each of the industries highlighted here, urban agriculture, life sciences, nightlife, amusements, and home-based businesses, today in our zoning faces ambiguity or outdated rules that we want to address so we can help emerging business types thrive across our city, create some clarity that makes it easier to locate and support these businesses. Proposal 7, businesses that want to operate indoor agriculture, such as vertical farming, in a commercial area face uncertainty with today's zoning. And we would clarify that indoor agriculture is allowed in commercial districts indoors so that food can be grown closer to communities. Proposal 8. Life sciences laboratories face confusing and outdated rules that slow the development of new facilities. We would make it clear that labs without the potential for environmental hazards are appropriate in office settings, and we'd expand where an existing special permit could be used so that labs might be able to locate in the future closer to research centers like hospitals and universities. Proposal 9. In any bar or restaurant in the city today, you can have live musical entertainment, such as a concert, so long as you're below 200 people. But our zoning often prohibits dancing to that music or having live comedy or open mic nights in the same space. We're simplifying the rules so that music, dancing, and comedy are all treated the same in zoning, while removing the last parts of the discriminatory cabaret law that prohibited the act of dancing in many places. Proposal 10. Zoning has outdated terms defining experiential businesses and amusement businesses like virtual reality or children's arcades, and it often restricts these kinds of businesses to Coney Island or the city's industrial areas. We would simplify and modernize how our zoning treats amusements and recreational activities, make clear these businesses are allowed indoors and at a small scale on a neighborhood commercial street, and at a larger scale in our city's office districts. Proposal 11. Many New Yorkers start their business in the home, and zoning today allows for a wide range of home business types, such as lawyers, jewelry makers, and music teachers. Now, the pandemic changed how New Yorkers work from home, but our zoning hasn't kept up, and it prohibits specific occupations like barbers or interior decorators and other restrictions that routinely hold back business creation. What we're proposing here is to enable entrepreneurship with modern rules for home-based businesses while keeping in place safeguards that ensure any home-based business would not be creating a nuisance. Proposal or goal number 3 is all about the ways in which we want to create more street-friendly neighborhoods that have active, safe, and walkable corridors. So economic vibrancy isn't just what happens inside a building, but how a business interacts with its surroundings. So these 3 proposals are designed to ensure that businesses contribute to active, safe, and walkable streets. Proposal 12, many parts of our city, you have no rules whatsoever that could prevent a new building with, say, a long blank wall or some sort of dark stores or something like that. So what we're proposing is to create a consistent and easy to understand baseline set of rules for commercial ground floor design, ones that are more responsive in areas that have more pedestrian activity, and ones that are more relaxed in the city's more auto-oriented corridors. Proposal 13 is around auto servicing and repair businesses. They're typically treated in our zoning as industrial, located far from retail streets and residential neighborhoods. But some exceptions exist in our zoning today that allows for auto repair and storage to spill out into the sidewalk and into the street in neighborhood commercial corridors. And this creates safety concerns. And so we want to rationalize and consolidate the way we think about auto repair, allow heavy vehicle maintenance in industrial areas so long as they're licensed by the state DMV, and allow light vehicle repair. They would no longer be allowed as of right in neighborhood commercial areas unless they go through a site plan review process with the Board of Standards and Appeals. Proposal 14, We have post offices in every neighborhood, but unless you're the federal government, you can't do the same kinds of parcel pickup and delivery within buildings except in our city's industrial areas. Now, this forces activity to occur on sidewalks and streets. It leads to more traffic congestion and pollution in areas both where the delivery occurs, but also in the industrial areas where the packages originate. What we're proposing here is to create a new type of use in our zoning called a micro-distribution facility and allow these businesses to locate at a small scale in commercial areas. This would encourage deliveries to shift to alternative modes of transportation and regulate the creation of local hubs for safe and sustainable deliveries to occur. Fourth and finally, our goal for number 4 is to create new opportunities for businesses to open, addressing our zoning toolkit in ways that can boost job growth and business expansion in the future. So outside of the as of right framework, we have all kinds of zoning tools that could be used to initiate a discretionary change process to change our city's underlying zoning regulations. These range from special permits with the Board of Standards and Appeals, City Planning Commission authorizations, and special permits, as well as the zoning districts themselves. So as we're seeking to modernize our city's zoning to support small business, we also want to update our zoning toolkit so businesses can have better access to pathways that enable their expansion or adaptation. So that's what these last 4 proposals are all about. They all create new kinds of zoning tools, all of which would require public review to be used in the future for the economic success of our city. Proposal 50. Many large-scale residential developments, they're zoned as residence districts, meaning retail, services, and makerspace cannot easily locate, and it places residents of these developments further away from local goods and services and access to job opportunities. This proposal would create a new kind of zoning tool that could allow for a limited amount of commercial space and underused office or storage, for example, on a large-scale residential campus, giving residents greater access to basic necessities or the space to grow new business. Proposal 16. Some portions of New York City are not within walking distance of a local store, and zoning has no pathways that could allow for a new locally serving business to open. We're creating a new kind of path where, through a public review process, a business could initiate the desire to locate a new kind of store on the corner of an intersection, provided that store does not generate any environmental concerns or traffic congestion. Proposal 17. In some instances, businesses lack options for waiving certain kinds of zoning rules. For example, film studios often struggle to build sound stages because of certain rules like yard requirements, setback heights, or a clothing store might want to expand to occupy an empty second floor or an empty storefront next to it, but finds that size limitations or location rules prevent them from doing so. We're expanding the zoning toolkit so businesses can initiate a process to waive some rules on a case-by-case basis. Proposal 18. Lastly, in some instances, it's our zoning districts, not the pathways to modify them, that are obsolete. This is particularly true of our city's manufacturing or M zoning district designations. Currently, low-density options, physical design rules, and high parking can make it impossible to build loft-like industrial buildings, even in areas where they exist historically. This proposal creates a range of new kinds of zoning tools at a range of densities and heights that can expand our zoning toolkit for the future. Next slide, please. So lastly, as Dan noted, we began formal public review in October. We've been hosted by community boards and well over 100 public meetings since then. We still have many more in the coming weeks. We have a lot of resources on our website to help you understand and digest these proposals. They're all at nyc.gov/yes economic opportunity. Ways to get into these proposals in great detail, as well as a number of resources to understand specific elements of what we're proposing. And with that, we'll stop sharing our screen and we'll jump right into some of the most frequent questions that we've been hearing. So I would ask our 3 guests to please fire away. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you for having this session today and for having us on the panel. I'm Laura Rothrock from the Long Island City Partnership. And we appreciated your overview and your communication. But I have heard that there's been some confusion generally just about what's in the proposal. So can you clarify, does it address housing or sustainability issues in this proposal?
Yeah, it's a great question, Laura, in part because City of Yes is not just one initiative, but 3 related initiatives. And while the City of Yes for Economic Opportunity does not focus on housing or sustainability issues, there are related in sequence. So I agree that it can be confusing. Altogether, the three separate City of Yes citywide zoning text amendments, they're the most ambitious changes we've had to our zoning since 1961. There's a ton of component parts underneath, so it can seem confusing to know what kinds of topics are covered in each, and so I totally understand. But I'll just note sort of the sequence for you and others listening. Three separate but related changes to our city zoning, part of City of Yes. The first is carbon neutrality, was recently adopted by the City Council. The second is economic opportunity, which I lead, currently in public review, going forward with all of the city's community boards, and borough presidents for that review. And the third is housing opportunity. Now, the timeline for housing opportunity it's a bit longer because of the extent of the required environmental review, which we anticipate being under development until the spring, followed by which point the proposal would begin the formal public review and being referred to the city's 59 community boards, but then eventually to the City Planning Commission and the City Council. And I'll note that if you are interested in learning more about either carbon neutrality or housing opportunity, you can find information on our website at nyc.gov/City of Yes.
Thank you.
Matthew,
Hi, Kevin.
how are you?
Doing
So,
well. Thank you.
I have attended a few of the community sessions, and I'm impressed and intrigued with the presentation, but I'm also noting some of the concerns that members of the community boards are raising. And one of them that jumps out in many places. It relates to housing. Folks are suggesting that the City of Yes and its for economic opportunity might bring pressure on existing housing stock and probably put communities that are more vulnerable in riskier situations. And I'm wondering if and how you have managed to look at this proposal and will be able to explain to people in my community that this is betterment for them and that they do not have to move to Georgia.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin, and I certainly understand the concern. Now, I do want to make sure that I note that economic opportunity is not anti-housing, and that the work we've been doing has been coordinated very closely with our colleagues, both in the carbon neutrality team in understanding the intersections between this proposal and that one, but also especially with the housing team in understanding the intersections and overlaps between economic opportunity and housing opportunity. Now, noting that the city faces multiple challenges, and each of the citywide zoning texts that we have, they're designed to address ways that our zoning makes it harder for the city to meet all three of these crises: climate, economic, and housing affordability. And they are very interrelated. And so the challenges we face are not mutually exclusive, and neither are the solutions. So by enabling businesses and buildings to better adapt to changing economic conditions, we can ensure that the city is more resilient and inclusive in its approach to facing both climate and housing. And so I totally understand and appreciate concerns about housing, and I look forward in conjunction with my colleagues to discussing zoning strategies we have to address our housing shortage in particular in the City of Yes for Housing Opportunity proposal, which, as I noted, it's currently in environmental review and will begin the formal public review later in the spring.
Hey, Matt, how are you? First and foremost, just want to thank you
Hi,
and
Raphael.
Gorodnik for putting together this info session. But on that note, right, and I get the urgency of getting this through, but as a former city council member, I was always concerned about process and public review. Could these changes take a power away from the community boards and the city council, given how quickly they're moving?
Yeah, thank you, Raphael. It's a great question. My short answer is no. We do not think it's taking power away, but let me talk about why. So today's zoning system, it contains a range of ways for talking about how businesses can locate. Most commonly, commercial businesses in our city's commercial areas, they're as of right. So they can, so long as the zoning says they can locate, they're allowed to do so, provided that they meet the other regulations around business location, things like the building code and the fire code, for example. Now, sometimes businesses they can locate contingent on certain conditions, for example, environmental conditions or things like their overall size. Now, in other cases, some business types are only allowed by special permission from the City Planning Commission or the Board of Standards and Appeals. And sometimes business types are prohibited in a particular area outright, meaning no one can grant them permission. There's no process. They would have to change the underlying zoning and what that zoning allows for a particular area. Now, a lot of our tools for our zoning have not been updated since the 60s either. And so some pathways exist for some business types. Other business types don't have those same pathways available to them. So part of what we're trying to do here is level the playing field, both for the pathways that businesses have, but also for making the zoning more modern and up to date so people can understand it. And I'll give you just a quick example. If you're a business type that's not allowed under, or excuse me, if you're a business type that didn't exist 60 years ago, let's say cell phone repair shops, we could not have anticipated that those would have opened up. The zoning isn't clear and doesn't explicitly say on where a cell phone repair shop you can go. You might make an assumption, oh, I'm a retail store, I do some repairs, I can locate anywhere else like any other retail business. And now that might be generally true, but in a more complicated instance, you might sign a lease for a space and not actually know that you are allowed to go there. And so that's the kind of uncertainty that is fundamentally inequitable. It is an uneven playing field for businesses. And so part of what we want to do here is updating that as of right framework so that businesses are much more clear on where they can go and what they can do, and updating the pathways we have to provide that clarity. So the vast majority of changes in City of Yes for economic opportunity are just making sure that the zoning is much more clear. There's a few instances, and we can, I noted those in my presentation. We can get more into that with some of your questions perhaps, but there's some times where the business type is prohibited and we would like it to be allowed. These are things like clean production businesses or indoor amusements, or some kinds of nightlife for dancing, for example. And then in some cases, we're clarifying language for uses that are already allowed, like laboratories. We're updating the terminology. And in other cases, you have business types that are currently allowed without going through any sort of review process, and then would have to go through a review process in the future, for example, auto repair businesses in commercial areas. And then lastly, there are some business types or opportunities that there is no pathway in our zoning, and we'd like to create one, for example, adding a corner store in a residence area. So I hope that answers your question.
So, Matt, in the uh, piggyback piggybacking on that question from Raphael and your response, digging deeper, I found folks concerned about parts of nightlife, some of the opening up of activities that would allow strip clubs and type of uses that would not be conducive to residential environment. So explain to us how do you think the city will be navigating some of these concerns?
Yeah, thank you for raising that, Kevin, because I want to be very clear. This is a place we've heard that concern, and it's a misconception. It's not true that we would be allowing strip clubs, for example, as part of this initiative. So the way that our zoning thinks about nightlife businesses, it pertains to bars and restaurants that allow dancing. Strip clubs under zoning are considered adult uses. They're permitted only in a very limited set of locations in the city, and we're not changing where adult uses are locating, are allowed to locate. So enforcement of the rules around adult uses is coordinated closely between the New York City Police Department, as well as the Mayor's Office of Special Enforcement. But thanks for the question.
And Matt, you had also mentioned corner stores, and I know that was number 16 in the proposals. And we have heard from community members about allowing commercial businesses in quieter stretches of residential neighborhoods. So can you talk a little bit about why you think it's important to have corner stores in some of these residential neighborhoods?
Yeah, it's a good question, and so the way I'll talk about it is small corner stores such as a bodega. They're a very key part of New York City's fabric. It's part of what makes New York unique. And there are literally thousands of other kinds of businesses that exist today across our city's residential areas. And generally, these businesses, they make life more pleasant and convenient for New Yorkers who need to just run down the block for a gallon of milk or, say, pick up a bacon, egg, and cheese on your morning commute to work. But there are areas in our city where a small store could not locate in a corner, even if it makes sense. And in fact, our analysis shows that there's more than 250,000 New Yorkers that are not within walking distance of a zoning district that would allow for a new kind of small business like this to locate. So in these areas, you can have things like traffic or air pollution or just simply access to basic necessities that's worse off, because there's no mechanism in our zoning to allow for local retail, even on a case-by-case basis. So what we're proposing here, it's not a blanket green light for new businesses in residential areas. What we're proposing is to create, it's called an authorization. So it requires a very site-specific environmental review as well as a community board review. And we think that the proposed zoning applications, by limiting it by size and use, it creates this balance where you would have a limited circumstance where additional businesses that service the community might, keyword might, be appropriate. But currently in our zoning, there's no legal avenue to even consider that sort of exception. So I hope that answers your question, concern.
Thank you.
Matthew, I'm pushing more on some of those same concerns in our commercial areas. People are thinking that allowing more commercial activity would blur the uses between the residential and the commercial framework. And our communities are known or defined by their residential character. So naturally, people would be concerned about pushing more commercial uses in their spaces. How is the city of Yes who would be responding to those who would be concerned about greater commercial activity in some of these residential spaces?
Yeah. I completely understand that concern, and especially as someone who lives in a residential area, I'll note that our built environment, and I'm sure many New Yorkers could agree with this, the built environment actually isn't as binary as our zoning makes it seem, and that even in areas that are zoned as residential, you have plenty of local businesses, and in our office areas, you have plenty of residents. And this mixed use neighborhood, an idea of the mixing of uses, it's been a part of New York and New York's fabric for as long as we've been a city. And even when the modern zoning was created in 1961, when it established commercial zones and residence zones and manufacturing zones, there always was and always has been quite a bit of crossover. Now, that said, in this proposal, there still will be commercial zones, there still will be residential zones, there still will be manufacturing zones, but fundamentally we see the opposite, that the creation of something like the corner store permit allows us to recognize circumstances where a community wants to approve a single store, not an overall commercial rezoning, which by design is a much larger neighborhood change. So to go back to your original question, I completely understand and share the concern that if you want to be in a residential area, you want to ensure that there is quality of life. And this proposal does so by creating those process safeguards so that you wouldn't see widespread change, but rather there would be a single application for a single corner store that could be considered on its own, on its merits, after going through both environmental review and through the community board process. So I hope that addresses the concern.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I guess to that point, Matt, I mean, there will be some changes, right? The other component of City of ES has to do with commercial activity in residential areas, especially with home-based businesses, which I want to know is great for freelance union members as they're all independent workers and many work from home. But as a New York City resident, will the changes lead to an increase in traffic? Will we see more delivery trucks, foot traffic, or will it generally affect our quality of life in our communities and residential buildings?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think the best way to answer is I think to start with what's already allowed, because going out to many community board meetings, that's where I think a lot of the confusion might be starting with understanding what is allowed and what the process looks like, and then what we're proposing, which admittedly are fairly small changes around the edges, but I can get into the details. So existing zoning has been in place for home businesses for more than 60 years. And it allows for a wide range of home business types. So you could be a lawyer, you could be a music teacher, you could be a jewelry maker, and all of these and many other kinds of businesses, they potentially generate customers, clients, deliveries, foot traffic, etc., for people who are visiting a home. And so the vast majority of time, I'll note, over the last 60 years, this has already been happening in every neighborhood without complaint for the most part. And so the existing zoning has a lot of safeguards in place to distinguish a home business from, let's say, a store. So the zoning is very clear that you have to live in the space. You can't have signage. You can't be a nuisance. You can't have more than today 25% of the dwelling unit, and you can't sell anything that you didn't make there. So you could be an Etsy maker, sell things from Etsy that you make yourself, but you can't buy something from someone else and then resell it in that same space. But in recognition that many New Yorkers are working from home, there's a few changes we've proposed to home-based business regulations. So we want to expand the size of that's allowed for home-based business from 25% to 49% of the home. This is particularly beneficial in instances where you have a small dwelling unit, for example, a studio or one bedroom. We want to allow, today you're allowed to have up to one employee outside who doesn't live with you to be part of your home-based business, be registered to that home-based business. We would expand from 1 to 3 employees. So this would allow you, for example, if you're a startup, to have a couple of other people who are registered to your home business. Or if you are, say, a contractor like a plumber or electrician, same deal, have some people who are registered to your business, even if they're not actually being in the home. Third, we want to remove the list of currently prohibited occupation types. So the zoning, the way it thinks about home businesses, you are allowed to be a home-based business in any occupation unless you're a few specifically listed business types. Now, we've tried to understand, going back to records at the time, to really understand the through thread of the commonality between these business types. And admittedly, we have yet to find what the common thread is, because things like interior designers or stockbrokers or public relations professionals are not allowed to operate in the home, period, which may be news to some who do this kind of work from home, and it's office work because of the way that technology has evolved. But the zoning also prohibits things like barbers or beauty, and these kinds of occupations. Many New Yorkers do have these kinds of occupations in the homes. We know this, especially coming out in the height of the pandemic, and we think that given all of the other safeguards we have in place, that it's okay to remove that list of prohibited occupations. So that's what we're looking at. It's increasing the size. One thing I'll note that I forgot to mention is that currently in many places there's a 500 square foot cap on a home-based business. We're proposing to eliminate that, sort of for the opposite reason of the percentage. So in places where you have larger dwelling units, say many single family homes, 500 square feet, which to me in my residence would feel like a luxury to have 500 square feet, maybe even just part of a room in some larger residences. And so that 500 square feet ends up becoming the limitation on being able to grow and expand your business. So that's what we're proposing. But I'll note lastly on enforcement. So under the pre-existing zoning, if you are doing anything that would be deemed a nuisance, so that's noise, odor, smoke, vibration, anything like that, then if your neighbor is deeming that offensive, it can be reported to the Department of Buildings by calling 311. And so that's one of the very key safeguards that we have. We're keeping all of that in place, as well as anything that other law or regulation has for regulating health and safety for specific industries as well. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you might have also answered, because I was thinking when you had mentioned beauty, you know, if there was a nail salon that was in a home-based business, for example, and there were fumes, will that be regulated? Who would people call? You know, at the partnership, we're always dealing with quality of life issues in Long Island City, so we navigate a lot of this, but maybe the average person wouldn't necessarily know who to call or who the agency is who's regulating some of these issues.
Sure. Yeah, happy to talk more about that as a specific instance. So if a home-based business were generating anything that's deemed a nuisance, so the zoning language, it says it includes specifically things like noise or vibration, could be smoke or dust or particulate matter, so fumes, odious matter, heat, glare, humidity, anything that the zoning calls objectionable, aka a nuisance, that home business activity can be reported to the Department of Buildings via 311 or one of the Department of Buildings borough offices, or sometimes it's a referral from another city agency, either doing inspections or responding to health and safety. So that could be the housing preservation and development, that could be the health department, that could be the fire department or the police department. Now, Department of Buildings can issue zoning violations for a building owner where a home occupation is violating the zoning. This could include fines. This could potentially include shutting down the business. But I also want to note something else, which is that any building or with a lease, co-op agreement, some sort of similar document, they can and do today place limitations on certain kinds of home business activity, and the violations of those legal agreements can result in further penalties or even eviction for the tenant or co-op holder that is violating the terms of that legal agreement. And so what we're proposing in City of Yes would keep all of the safeguards that I've been mentioning in the last few minutes in place, but it does also make changes to modernize our home business regulations. So limiting the business types currently prohibited, such as barbers, but also lifting the outdated square footage caps on business activity so that New Yorkers can be able to work from home. And what we know, what the research shows, is that today's home-based businesses become tomorrow's storefront or office tenants, and that the life cycle of a business often starts in the home. We saw this a lot during the pandemic. People get their start in the home, and then once they have the capital, once they have the resources, once they've tested their idea, their innovation, or their business model, then they often want to go to a storefront or office space. So in a sense, every home-based business is a bit like a miniature business incubator. It's really good for the city's future to enable and make sure that the rules we have around home-based businesses are modern and they reflect today's economy. And so we think that this proposal does that.
Matthew, concern that I pick up, and it's coming out of your response to Laura. And again, in the back of the room, you will hear people say things, and one of them that is sticking in the back of my mind, and it's the how do we ascertain, how do we ensure, how do we establish that these clean businesses that could be promoted, I mean, and the scale that we're talking about, you know, small clean might be okay, but how about this clean? Yeah. No, dirty rather, in terms of industries. How do you respond to those who might have concern in living either near, upstairs, or beside some entity, no matter how small, that they might deem not clean businesses?
Yeah, that makes sense. Just to clarify, Kevin, you're talking about the clean production and the manufacturing business
Clean
proposal?
production,
Okay,
I mean,
okay.
yeah, clean production.
Gotcha. Yeah, so totally understand your concern, and when looking at this proposal, first off, we wanted to make sure that the only kind of businesses that would be allowed in proximity with residences are those that have a track record of being considered clean and quiet and have the environmental safeguards built into the zoning to ensure that. So quick history lesson. Current zoning was written at a time when most manufacturing was done in large factories and was meant for mass production and global distribution. And our zoning reflects that sort of framework of what planners in the middle of the 20th century looking forward thought that manufacturing would look like. They did not anticipate environmental regulation because our current zoning predates all modern environmental regulation. They also didn't anticipate technological changes that would enable forms of clean production in ways to capture things like air quality concerns or hazardous waste concerns and things like that. So our current zoning reflects a mindset of the time that it made sense to separate many kinds of manufacturing into M zones and locate them places where new homes were generally not allowed. So technology's changed a lot, and so has our ability to safely regulate a range of certain kinds of production or manufacturing businesses to be able to locate closer where people live and where people work. So the types of businesses and the only ones that would be eligible to locate commercial areas are ones that are both clean and quiet. So these are things like pottery studios or bakeries, all kinds of craft making or custom carpentry or apparel production. And that all of the other kinds of regulations that we have, things like the city's environmental review and Department of Buildings inspections, are also really key parts of this and remain. Now, you mentioned clean a few times, so I just want to go into a little bit more detail on what that means. Clean production means that the business has met stringent environmental standards that ensure that the business doesn't have the potential to create negative air quality or noise or traffic or other kinds of environmental concerns for any of its neighbors. There's a lot of regulations in our zoning that ensure this. So in all instances, in order to locate a commercial area, the business would be subject to the same standards we have in our special mixed use areas. These are colloquially known as our MX districts. So these are places where you allow for light industrial and residences in the same building in many instances. And so these have been allowed across the city since the 90s. And the rules that we have for our city's MX districts, stipulate that the business has to not have air quality emissions that exceed a state environmental threshold, or generate what's known as a right to know filing for storing hazardous or potentially storing or using potentially hazardous chemicals. So any business that is filing a right to know or has that state air quality requirement is not allowed to locate in a commercial area, period. End stop. But other things we're doing that are built into the zoning itself, we are adopting the performance standards that we have in the zoning today for our M1, our light industrial areas. And we are saying that the businesses that would locate in commercial areas must follow them. And then additionally, if any business were to have a venting requirement, say city, state, or federal regulations require you to do some sort of venting, then you would have to vent at the highest tier of the building or an adjacent building. Now, I'll also note that in the vast majority of instances, this is considered a change of use. So in order for these businesses to locate, they would have to go through the full process with the Department of Buildings, signing off on mechanical code, building code, fire code, and everything else, just to make sure that they're able to safely locate. So as you can tell, there's a lot built into the zoning itself. I'd encourage you to take a look at the details, but that can help ensure that the businesses that are able to locate, that do production, are ones that are clean and safe to locate near residences and other neighbors.
Now, to that point, Matt, right, there are many producers that don't provide neighborhood services. So is it a good idea to use neighborhood commercial space for them? Or can we require these businesses to have some sort of consumer-facing retail?
Yeah, I understand the concern. What I would say is that many kinds of production businesses do provide services to neighborhood residents. These range from food producers like coffee roasters and breweries that you might think of, but also things like furniture or custom manufacturers that provide home goods. And so if you look at other cities across the country, many of them do allow for this kind of artisan production in storefront space or an office space. And we think that New York City absolutely should be able to allow this, provided that you meet those environmental standards that I just mentioned.
And Matt, I know we're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask about, you mentioned life sciences, and I know that's a part of this proposal. In Long Island City, we do have a growing presence of life science businesses here in laboratory space. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the city will address any safety concerns around residents being located close to lab space.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I actually think, given the time, this may be our last one. But I totally understand. As life sciences grows across the city, we want to make sure that labs are okay and are safe to locate in office settings. So we've been working on this proposal very closely with partner agencies to support and understand the details around laboratories, because the details matter. And we've learned a lot that this is one of the most highly regulated industries that exists in our country today. And so you have public safety interests protected through a very robust safety process. This includes health and safety guidelines and inspection from the fire department, from both city and state health agencies, from city, state, and federal environmental, as well as guidance from the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control, which regulate, frankly, everything from how to handle a petri dish to air filtration standards. Now, City of Yes only seeks to clarify that the terminology for a laboratory is more reflective of the kinds of research that are going on today, and that the process for locating a lab is clear, because today there's a lot of ambiguity. And so today, if you want to locate a lab in a commercial area, say on the west side of Manhattan or in a commercial district in Long Island City, and you try to get a loan, you're asked by a lender, are you allowed? And under the zoning resolution, it's very clear that if you're an M district, you're allowed. But if you're in a commercial area, the language says something about dental and medical laboratories, or you can manufacture dentures, but it's unclear what else. And so we have existing city interpretation from the Department of Buildings that describes that it's okay for labs to locate in office settings, but we want to make sure that the zoning itself is very clear that existing interpretation is codified. So the changes that we have in City of Yes are an important step to allow for safe and certified research to take place near important partners like hospitals and universities. One quick note on this, and I think we're just about out of time, is that we have a special permit for labs as well, but it's only limited in where it can be used, certain geographies. And so we also want to allow for that special permit to be used in other places, so that you could, say, locate a startup incubator closer to a hospital or university. But I will note, the special permit, anyone would have to go through the full environmental review and full community board process in order to locate there too. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Matt. I think we are going to have that be the last word for today. And let me note, this has been a really helpful conversation. I want to thank in particular Kevin, Laura, and Raphael for your thoughtful questions. Matt, nice work. They put you on the hot seat. I think you made it through safely. So congrats on that. And just as a reminder to everyone who is watching, the proposal is currently being heard by community boards and borough presidents. They're going to be issuing their recommendations in the coming weeks. And we hope that you will use the information that you gain from this conversation as you weigh in on the proposal with your local community board, or if you wish to weigh in with us at the City Planning Commission hearing on the 24th. And as we work to update our zoning regulations for the 21st century to build a stronger, more vibrant city and economy, your input here, it's really critical. And you can learn more about how to get engaged at nyc.gov/yes economic opportunity. But with that, again, let me say thank you to you, Matt, for all of your time and attention in explaining this complicated proposal publicly. And of course, again, to our panelists, Kevin, Laura, and Raphael, we really appreciate your being with us today. And with that, we will sign off. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.